welcome to the Pacifica Experience Day. We'll get started in a few minutes as all participants join. Hello, my name is Jessica Rubenstein. I'm the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Welcome to our virtual Pacifica Experience Day. Just a quick note about Zoom. If you look on the top right corner and click speaker view, that will show you the view of who is speaking at the moment. So let's first get started with the President of Pacifica Graduate Institute, President and CEO, Joseph Cambray.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to everyone. It's wonderful to have you all with us virtually. This is really becoming a 21st century education in a very profound way. And welcome to our extended learning community. I hope in the near future that conditions will be safe enough for you all to be able to come to campus. It would be very nice to meet you in person. But for right now, we are living through this pandemic and finding ways to adapt, and this is a part of it. So in a way, we're preparing all of ourselves for the future because the country itself is going through a pivot to working remotely, to dealing with issues of safety and health concerns as primary, and Pacifica is very much a part of that. We have officially kept our campuses closed at least through the end of this this calendar year, through the end of December, and we're looking at the winter and spring in conjunction with that.
So now let's hear from Peter Rojcewicz, who is the Provost here at Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Good morning, I'm Peter Rojcewicz, Pacifica's Provost. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your patience with the technology. You know, many people today are carefully considering and thinking about educational opportunities during this time of radical uncertainty. They hope to strategically find their way through a world that's defined by increasing complexity and rapid unpredictable change. And the question of grasping the nature and order and the way of the world has long been a question sought throughout higher education. But what's different today is the question itself is highly problematized because the traditional certitudes of the academy are hotly contested. And so institutions of higher education are asking the question, how should they respond to a world that's presently under siege by the COVID-19 pandemic, by systemic racism, by unpredictable and volatile economic markets, by an increasing global mental health crisis, the ongoing deterioration of the earth, and how should they respond in such a way that makes matriculation into a graduate degree program a sagacious act and decision. At Pacifica, we respond in this way. We are training people to respond and to grasp to the warp and woof of the fabric of reality as it is today, with such features as paradox and chaos and uncertainty and liminality and asymmetry and synchronicity. And to that end, we are fashioning our curriculum and our pedagogy to develop and provide for our students important adaptive psychological skills like frustration tolerance, cognitive flexibility, resilience, response ableness, and the ability to discern one's self-agency as a doer from being done to by others and by other forces. Pacifica is focusing its curriculum not narrowly upon individual disciplines, which is a model more appropriate for a world that's long gone, but we favor holism and systems thinking and therefore feature transdisciplinarity and interdependence of knowledge. So why Pacifica now? To help people navigate this turbulent world, all of our degree programs are rooted in depth psychology, because a knowledge of the self is a prerequisite for all other forms of knowledge. Our degree programs study the unconscious mind, because the unconscious, like the very world that we are living in today, is defined by uncertainty, by change, by shadow, by non-rationality, by self-organization, and it expresses those features in myths, in dreams, in the imagination, and synchronistic events. There is a deep and powerful imperative at the core of Pacifica's own self-understanding mission to preserve the connection between knowledge and the zest for life by bringing together and uniting what is traditional with what is presently emerging in the world as part of a vital and timely, imaginative reconsideration of learning. This self-development mission of Pacifica Graduate Institute strives to develop people who are capable of never succumbing to a feeling of futility, that they have come to the end of what is worth knowing, worth having, worth doing, or worth being. And we do this by focusing on the cognitive imagination, the most important human faculty. The imagination in two of its aspects, and its instrumental aspect to help people grasp the objective and mechanistic possibilities and processes of life, but equally or even more important, the empathic imagination, the capacity to enter into the interiority and feel deeply and respectfully into the lived experience of all living beings, including the earth itself, so that we can have an intimate and respectful relationship with others, not an I-it relationship, but an I-thou relationship. And I think this is what Walt Whitman intended when he wrote, "There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became, and that object became part of him." I invite you to come to Pacifica and be part of our intentional community that calls us to forge a new myth of learning, that calls us into a deeper awareness and passion and a commitment to the world that we live in today, right? And we do this by learning with one another and learning from one another and learning on behalf of one another and the earth we share. Thank you for being here with us today, and I look forward to seeing you someday, I hope, at Pacifica Graduate Institute.
Well, I'm back. I hope this is getting through clearer and with better sound. My apologies. This is one of the things about working remotely from multiple different locations. The quality of the internet does vary. So thank you for bearing with me. But I just want to underscore some of what Provost Rojcewicz was saying. And to point out things like the movement towards telehealth throughout our entire country. For the first time ever, the insurance companies of the United States have begun to allow invoices to be submitted for psychotherapy that's being conducted over the internet. And that's something that's not likely to change. So learning skills to work therapeutically, for example, online is a very valuable new tool. And it will go across the board to all kinds of positions, whether at universities or in various companies or in your own private businesses, whatever your final goal is, this will be part of who we are all becoming. We're in the moment of archetypal change. And even the notion of the unconscious, I think, will be revised over the course of the next decade. I think we're going to look at new models, for example, going from an old energy model into an information model, that we understand the kind of the way information and the informational unconscious is part of the sea we're embedded in. And the fact that the psyche is an ecological system. It's not just mine, it's not just yours, it's something that gets co-created with all of us. This is part of the notion of a collective unconscious that we are all in. The model I like to go to is from ecology. It's a kind of rhizomal model that the interconnectedness is not seen on the surface, but it's below. It's hidden, yet it's very real, and it's even quite tangible. And it's a fundamental structure to the nature of the brain, the universe, the natural world, and I think human communication. So that's part of the moving that we're exploring here at Pacifica. How do we transform ourselves and our theories into something that is the most current and most relevant, not just for the present moment, but really for where we're headed? And that's what we see our educational mission is to form an extended learning community worldwide, to be a network. And this is an invitation to join us in that construction. Because as Peter said, we have a holistic view. And if you look at the problems that we as a society are facing, I think this is extremely important. Whether it's climate change, or whether it's systemic racism, or whether it's in many ways the minimization of the pandemic, the mechanisms of denial are what are getting in our way for truly solving what we need to do. And therefore a systemic approach that really opens us up to exploring all of those linkages is really what's important. And I think the internet can be a tool for that. So despite the complexities of this, I invite you to join us and continue with the movement that we're doing here. We will meet together again as the conditions make it safe. But for now, we live locally and connect globally. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm sorry for the disruption of the services. Okay, thanks. Jessica, back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to give a brief overview of the day today. So first we will have our featured presentation, and then after that we will have 2 program breakout sessions. So if you are perhaps interested in 2 different programs and deciding between the 2, you have the opportunity to join one and the other. They will be from 11:30 to 12:30 and 12:45 to 1:45. And then after that at 2 o'clock, we will have a student services panel with admissions and financial aid. So if you are interested in getting any questions answered related to those topics, feel free to join. We will have some presentations, and you'll also get a chance to speak individually with our departments. You can learn more about our admissions processes, different questions related to specific financial aid cases and items like that. I want to remind you again for speaker view on Zoom, if you look on the top right-hand corner, there's a button that says speaker view, and that will allow you to just see who is speaking rather than those of us who are currently on the webinar muted. I also want to remind you that because you joined this event today, you are welcome to apply to Pacifica Graduate Institute for free. So on the landing page that had all the links to these webinars, there's a link that says free application link. So if you scroll right about to the middle of the page, it'll say application for enrollment, and that waives our $75 fee. So click that link. If you haven't applied already, please fill out the application to join our programs. I also wanted to let you know that this day will be recorded. So if you miss a portion of it or want to go back and view, it will be sent out in about a week. And also, if you are in your breakout sessions with your programs and speaking to faculty, if you are somebody who doesn't want to be on a recording, if you don't want to have yourself heard or your video to be shown, please turn it off, both your audio and your video. The recordings will only be shared to members who paid the fee and are joining today, but if you don't want yourself recorded at all, please turn off your video and audio during your program breakout sessions. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker. Our featured speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Nelson. She is the core faculty member in the Integrative Therapy and Healing Practices program. She's also the chair of the Graduate Research Council at Pacifica. She's also the editor of the Journal of Jungian Scholarly Studies. And she's presenting today on Fierce Young Women in Fiction and in Reality. And you will also get an opportunity to ask her questions starting at 11:05. So at 11 o'clock, we'll be opening up the Q&A. If you have any questions for Dr. Nelson, you can place those questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So let's get started.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak. So thank you also to Peter and Joe for saying something about the meaning of an education at Pacifica at this moment. I fully agree with everything that has been said. There's something about the depth psychological perspective that serves as a kind of orienting device in the midst of chaos. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that today. So I want to begin just by saying a few things. Jung's psychology is fundamentally archetypal. It's a perspective on individual and communal life that invites us to see deep patterns of meaning that are inclusive, multicultural, historical, and spiritual. The archetypal I helps us navigate volatile, chaotic moments in human history, such as right now. In this lecture, we shall train our archetypal I on one pattern, the rise of the fierce young woman in politics, culture, literature, and film. She is the central protagonist in her own story, a visionary warrior-renegade who is bold, action-oriented, with things to do and no time to waste. Sometimes she confronts systemic misogyny head-on. Sometimes she just moves around it with an eye roll, pitying the retrograde vestiges of caveman mind. I've been tracking the fierce young woman in fiction and reality for about 20 years, my interest growing deeper and sharper over time. As it turns out, she has been tracking me too, showing up in odd, uncanny ways, such as an invitation to study theatrical combat 30 years ago, when I was spending way too much time in front of my computer screen writing my master's thesis. I was planning to write a dissertation on the deep structure of the internet about 22 years ago, and then I got hijacked by the sharp knife in the fairy tale of Eros and Psyche, the knife that nobody, including scholars, was talking about. And then a third thing is that I became fascinated by the seismic shift in American military policy 15 years ago, when women's boots were on the ground in active combat zones for the first time in an overt way. I have since learned that this is the way of the deep psyche. When any of us becomes fascinated by an archetypal image or pattern, we enter a lively archetypal field. It feels a little bit like being in a Pixar film in which everything around you comes to life. And this is a feature of education at Pacifica. You will be surprised, as all of my students have been, by the images that become active for you, the ones that grow in your imagination. And what I like to see is that the way they become companions on your scholarly journey. So the images are alive. This is an essential premise of the archetypal approach. Before I begin speaking about fierce young women, I acknowledge that the topics of gender and power are controversial. They're difficult. For some of us, our complexes get activated. When that happens, it is challenging to think with precision and subtlety, which is exactly what I'm going to ask us to do. True confession, fierce young women activate me too. I feel a sense of exhilaration when I see someone grow into their powers and use those powers on behalf of what they love. I've been an advocate for young women for a very long time, annoyed when they are taught to play small because they are female. I'm annoyed when they are urged to capitulate because they are the so-called tender sex, as though the moral weight of goodness, tenderness, and kindness rests entirely on female shoulders. That's a naive view of women, and it's deeply unfair to men. It evacuates ethical behavior from men and assumes that woman, qua female, is morally superior. There's something desperately wrong with that. Yes, the world needs much more tenderness and love, but I have learned over the past few decades, personally, professionally, and as a Jungian scholar, that love and power are not mutually exclusive, as some would have us believe. Rather, as the young women featured in today's lecture demonstrate, we can and must use our powers on behalf of what we love. Without our powers, our love would be ineffectual, a passive sentiment rather than an active capacity. In fact, this would be a fine time to quote just a few sentences of Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic National Convention Wednesday night, when she accepted the nomination for vice president. She said near the end of her 18-minute speech, "To love our country is to fight for the ideals of our country. So let's fight with conviction. Let's fight with hope. Let's fight with confidence in ourselves and a commitment to each other." Kamala is using language that echoes the mission of every fierce young woman I have studied in the last 20 years. The archetypal pattern is alive and well, and was on display Wednesday night. More true confessions. I'm excited rather than repulsed by images of women handling weapons skillfully, whether the weapon is a broadsword or a magic wand, a shield or a laptop, a quarterstaff or a dragon. I'm a formal martial artist and have a collection of theatrical combat weapons. Of course I'm going to like this stuff. My hobbies may be a little bit eccentric, but at the end of the day, personal power and effectiveness comes down to an embodied sense of vitality, the ability to move through the world with animal grace, strength, and alertness. I wish that for everyone. And now I am going to begin the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, and there we go. All right. Fierce young women in fiction and reality. This is my topic for the day. All right. So as I said just a moment ago, at the end of the day, personal power comes down to an embodied sense of vitality, the ability to move through the world with animal grace, strength, intelligence, and alertness. Some of us, though, refuse to accept martial females because the world does not need more violence. I'm going to ask you to question what you think martial means, what ground it covers. Yes, the word martial stems from the Roman god of war, Mars. Yes, the Romans were a particularly bellicose culture. But when we examine the many associations to the word martial, it is not restricted to warfare. To be martial is to be driven and vital, focused and fierce, assertive and spirited. Martial qualities are action-oriented and effective. To be martial is to be human, just as these moms are being deeply human and martial, vital and driven, assertive and spirited. No weapons there except their values, their commitment, and the linked arms. Well, and masks and bicycle helmets. That was important too. We need our martial qualities if we want to live our values in troubled or risky times and create a more just world. We especially need our martial qualities to confront any of the contemporary meta-narratives that perpetuate injustice. So, what is a meta-narrative? It is a widespread, overarching story that infiltrates how we think, speak, and act. It's justified as natural because it originates in human evolutionary history, according to the people who support the meta-narrative. They are insidious meta-narratives. We thoughtlessly assume that that's the way things are, and we're equally blind to how we perpetuate them. There are three critically important meta-narratives of oppression right now, very, very important meta-narratives that have been capturing the headlines. One, of course, is systemic racism. Another is systemic homo and transphobia. And the third is systemic misogyny. This morning, I'm going to be looking at systemic misogyny and how it is enacted in the world through toxic masculinity. So let's talk a little bit about what toxic masculinity is and is not. Very important theory that we need to get clear on. So it's not the idea that masculinity itself is toxic. It's a narrow, corrupt form of masculinity. It's achieved through violence, sex, status, and aggression. It's the cultural idea of manliness, where strength is everything and emotions are a weakness, where sex and brutality are yardsticks by which men are measured, while supposedly feminine traits, which can range from emotional vulnerability to simply not being hypersexual, are the means by which your status as a man can be taken away. Life, according to this viewpoint, is a deadly serious predation, a zero-sum dominance game in which winning is the only goal. Sustaining a dominance hierarchy justifies all manner of manipulation because those who rise to the top of the political, social, and economic heap are winners and by definition, the fittest. Dominance hierarchy is also supported by the presumption of entitlement. Whatever I have the power to take, including perhaps, especially females, is mine to have by any means necessary. Sex is conquest and women are property. A powerful woman of any age is a severe threat, a very severe threat to the worldview of toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity, like any worldview, can shape us more than we realize. Clearly, it affects girls and women, but it also affects good men. Men who are tender, loving, emotionally intelligent, and available. Men who are visionary, cooperative, collaborative, with the kind of eco-intelligence that the world desperately needs today. Toxic masculinity can insidiously infect families, organizations, institutions, and entire cultures. And so the question comes down to something quite simple. Cui bono? Who benefits? So two questions occurred to me as I think about this. Might the overt expression of toxic masculinity today, which has been on the rise overtly since 2016, be a compensatory response to the rise of fierce young women? Might one attitude be a compensation for the other, a reaction to the other? The second question is, how does it serve systemic misogyny to assert that female weakness is natural or innate? And there's a further question that depth psychologists love, which is, what do we really mean by weakness? What are we saying when we use that word weakness? Depth psychologists, most of the ones that I know anyway, absolutely love dictionaries of etymology because we go into the deep history of words, their origin, their traditions, the subtle shades of meaning that have changed over time. So weak and weakness is a word that is worth exploring in this topic. The important point is that adopting a limited view of a woman's aptitude for power, including her actual capacity for aggression, is naive. It's a remnant of the sentimental 19th century view of woman as the angel in the house, woman as morally superior to men and entrusted with upholding the purity of society and culture. This idea is not only naive, it is unfair to women and to men, as I mentioned earlier. Why should I, as a woman, hold myself to a higher ethical standard than a man? Why should I assume that he, because he is a man, has a lower standard of ethics? Thinking of power as masculine also reflects one idea of power: power as domination. This is very different from a finely differentiated understanding of the many kinds of power that are indigenous to human beings. In other words, the idea of domination dominates our idea of power, which is the point of James Hillman's 1995 book. So long as it does, we will remain dangerously ignorant. So just like the small word weakness, the word power is also something that deserves to be examined closely. So let's follow Hillman and imagine many kinds of power. One of the questions I'm going to be posing today is, what kinds of power does each of the fierce young women that we're going to be looking at demonstrate? So for instance, we might examine how the power of influence is different from the power of perseverance. How is decisiveness a kind of power, the ability to choose clearly? What about patience? Is it too a kind of power? There are many times when patience and persistence are the most powerful way to be. When, for example, is it better to think strategically or tactically? And how are those two approaches related to one another? And is knowing the difference between strategy and tactic a kind of power? And would we call that power discernment, the ability to differentiate? These are all kinds of powers. So this is the subtlety and precision that I'm going to be inviting you to think about today as we go on. All right, so Hillman invites us to view many kinds of power, many kinds of power. In his 1995 book, he names 20 of them, but I'm imagining that any of us could name at least 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 more. But it's this subtle ability to really think clearly about a central aspect of human life, and something that has been so badly abused of late. That is important. All right, so now let us turn to some fierce young women. I'm going to talk about the first wave of female-centered fiction from 2005 to 2013. I'm going to be looking at expressions of power by young women growing towards adulthood in popular novels and films. And I'm also going to show how this trend, which began in 2005, has not only continued, it has accelerated. During this short span of time, best-selling works worth billions of dollars, actually their accumulated value is in the trillions, made a huge impact in popular culture. Some of you can recognize the faces on the screen, and some of you might not. The Twilight Saga, the Millennium Trilogy, the Hunger Games Trilogy, and the Divergent Trilogy all centered upon fierce young women protagonists who are aggressive, armed, and dangerous. Couple of things worth knowing, something that I just found out actually a few weeks ago, is that when the 4th and final book of the Twilight Saga was released in 2008, it sold 1.2 million copies within 24 hours. So these figures give you an idea of the sales data up until the most recent sales data that I could get, which is as of 2019. So the Millennium Trilogy, which you may not recognize by that name, but it's the girl with the dragon tattoo, more than 80 million copies. Twilight Saga, 120 million copies. Hunger Games, 100 million copies, and that's not counting the new prequel that was just released. The Divergent Trilogy, 32 million copies. A couple of more pieces of data about the prominence of female-centered fiction. In August 2014, Amazon announced that the Hunger Games trilogy had officially passed J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter as its best-selling book series of all time. Now, just pause for a moment and think about who was the female protagonist in the Harry Potter series, a series which I happen to love. Well, it was a sidekick, Hermione Granger. She's a wonderful character, but the series is not named Hermione Granger, it's named Harry Potter. However, Katniss Everdeen is the protagonist, the central protagonist of the Hunger Games. So a shift right there. When the third book of the Divergent trilogy was released, it demolished HarperCollins' first day sales records by moving 455,000 copies. So this gives you an idea of the commercial impact of this kind of fiction. In a 2010 NPR article, John Powers said that the allure of Lisbeth Salander from the Millennium Trilogy and Bella Swan from the Twilight Saga represents a sweeping change in popular culture. And there is every indication that the sweeping change is an irreversible transformation. The trend continues. The second wave of female-centric fiction from 2012 forward has great force. Just some of the fierce young women that have captivated the imagination of the world. As a Jungian attuned to activated archetypal patterns in culture, this abrupt, unprecedented shift in modern fairy tales seizes my attention. I'm going to return to some of these images in just a few moments. But now I'd like to look at something else, which is fierce women in reality. Archetypal patterns worthy of our attention are not restricted to fiction. Sometimes fiction, though, especially fantasy fiction, leads the way. In this case, something just as radical was happening in American military policy at precisely the same moment as the first wave of female-centered fiction starting in 2005, which ought to get the attention of all of us. For the first time in US history, female soldiers were engaged in direct ground combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their skill, strength, and dedication astonished some of their deeply skeptical male instructors. On August 21st, 2015, 2 young women graduated from the Army's Ranger School, the absolute toughest, most demanding course in the military. The graduation of First Lieutenant Kristen Geist and Captain Shay Haver is a significant crack in the wall keeping women formally off the battlefield. Their success and other social, economic, and political forces led the historic decision in December 2015 to lift all role restrictions for women in the US Armed Services. As David Jones put it, no martial domain is exclusive to either males or females. Both attacked enemy strongholds, defended castles, laid sieges, and led expeditionary forces. Both built military empires, dueled for honor with sword and pistol, and designed military strategy. Spying, terrorism, banditry, and piracy, assassination, demolitions, aerial combat, guerrilla warfare, hand-to-hand combat all boast expert women practitioners. I'm now really paying attention. But I want to pause one moment. My excitement about these developments might be mistaken for warmongering. Not so. I'm not going to speak about US foreign policy or the human and financial cost of military activity in the Middle East. I could talk about why young women are being mostly welcomed in the military, as women have been conveniently recruited into so-called masculine roles at other times in American history. So I am not a warmonger. I am not promoting world conflict, but I am deeply excited about remaking old, tired gender scripts. As Rosalind Miles and Robin Cross say, the reality of women at war challenges a profoundly held fantasy in both women and men, that men make war to protect and defend women, that women are too weak to fight and unsuited for warfare, and that all women have to do in wartime is to keep the home fires burning. I dislike this fantasy. It places an unacceptable burden on men. It also supports the insidious assumption that a man's life is more expendable. It's a limiting fantasy for women because there are many battles worth fighting on behalf of myself, my sisters, and the men we love. In fact, fierce women, young and old, are appearing in real life here and abroad. Since January 2017, American women have been embroiled in a deadly serious cultural war on multiple fronts. We are seeing the activation of an archetypal pattern, long unrecognized by patriarchal thinking and actively repressed by systemic misogyny. When we bring an archetypal eye to this pattern, its clarity is stunning. So let's say a little bit more about that archetypal eye, as I promised earlier. Hillman defines the archetypal eye as a way of regarding events that is poetic and symbolic and metaphorical, not literal. It's trained through a profound appreciation of history and biography, of the arts, of ideas, and culture. By attaching archetypal to an image, we ennoble or empower the image with the widest, richest, and deepest possible significance. The fecundity and generativity suggested by archetypal is of a special kind in a special direction. This has been indicated by my use of words such as unfathomable, patterned, hidden, rich, prior, deep, necessary, permanent. So let's go back to those fierce young women and look at her qualities. They're vital, passionate, and committed to a cause. They develop a distinctive form of power, often related to the weapon that they choose. They use their power on behalf of those they love. They develop a strong affiliation with their pack. Their prowess includes clear strategic thinking, physical strength, toughness, and skill. Rigorous training for them is a psychological feat as well as a physical one. It's a feat of focus and persistence. They tolerate pain and accept failure on the way to success. They develop an embodied sense of their own internal power. I wonder if fierce young women in fiction and reality are seizing our attention quite dramatically because they are ready to step onto a battlefield of their own choosing. This is certainly a battlefield of my choosing. In my writing, speaking, and teaching, I'm a passionate advocate for women who are viewed in disrespectful and naively reductive terms, put in their place for the comfort and convenience of a culture that prefers well-behaved women. You may be wondering why I devote myself to a complex understanding of fierce young women in fiction. At first, I was simply entertained, enjoying cheeky, funny, complex characters like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. enchanted by the determination of Elizabeth Salander, the girl with the dragon tattoo. So yes, at first, there is the young women themselves. Then I slowly began to realize what John Powers of NPR meant. The modern fairy tale was shockingly different. These fierce young women are the center of their own story, not sidekicks. Who among us doesn't dream of that? The fierce young women prominent in popular culture exhibit the ferocious instinctual strength and deep loyalty to their pack, reminiscent of the wild woman archetype described by Pinkola Estes in her 1992 best-selling book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. They are forced to navigate treacherous worlds, high stakes for which they live their lives, and the deep moral values that they must decide may in part explain their appeal to readers of all ages. In these fantasy worlds, emotional situations the protagonist faces are realistic, moving, and relatable. Such worlds may be no more fantastic than the mythic stories from remote religious and cultural traditions that fascinate Jungians, beginning with Jung's Symbols of Transformation, first published in 1912. Still, you may be skeptical. Why popular culture? I mean, really? Aren't there many more important things to study? Here are 3 of my answers. Stories that move readers need not be literally true to offer contemporary women and men imaginative possibilities in feeling, thought, and action, beyond what is supposedly natural in any given socio-cultural context. Many scholars, including Jung and some Jungians, argue that popular culture is psychologically meaningful. Noticing influential stories is a potent means to explore what is alive in the collective psyche. Even though specific works fade from memory, the archetypal longing they activate is far older and deeply ingrained. The individual characters are less durable than their archetypal basis. In defense of popular culture, it is important to mention that Jung himself was not an elitist. The collected works discuss Goethe's Faust, which is high art, and Rider Haggard's pulp novel She, which is very low art, because both offer insights into the social, political, and economic context shaping the psyche. We might also note that Jung based one of his key moves in dream analysis, amplification, on a wide exploration of context. Jungians draw upon many different disciplines for the historical, mythical, religious, and cultural resonance of a so-called personal dream image. For instance, the black cat in your dream last night might belong to your neighbor, but it could also refer to Bastet, one of the cat-headed goddesses of ancient Egypt, or it could refer to Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman. To summarize, quoting James Hillman, depth psychologists must pay attention to all culture, all forms of human activity. This attention is especially pertinent when events attract critical acclaim and earn billions of dollars in a few short years. One measure of interest is commercial success. There's another important point that I want to make about the role of mainstream media in offering us gender roles. Contemporary media, including novels, film, television, music, define emergent sexual codes of conduct. They pass judgment and establish the rules of play. There is an important relationship between popular culture, material conditions, and gendered identities. To go on, Richard Frankel, who wrote a wonderful book called The Adolescent Psyche, says we must attend to how the adolescent's imagination is fed through the music, movies, television, literature, and poetry that are attracted to and actively seek out. From an archetypal perspective, we might ask, how do the songs, poems, dances, and stories resonate with pre-existing patterns in the adolescent psyche that actively demand attention? Frankel urges us to focus a psychological eye on such media, taking heed of the powerful cultural forces impacting adolescence. Another point that's rather interesting is looking at the transgenerational appeal of Fierce Young Women. An analysis of the sales data on 4 contemporary novels and films from this first wave of new fairy tales reveals something quite interesting, even surprising. Stories about fierce young women attract audiences both young and old. Yes, girls 16 and women in their 60s. As the recent success of other blockbuster novels, film, and television demonstrate, boys flock to female-centered stories too. An archetypal approach might explain the cross-generational allure of fierce young women. Yes, girlhood is a pattern of experience, a stage of life. It occurs biologically during youth, and it can be reactivated and remembered in older women. In other words, one's girl can deeply identify with contemporary tales of fierce young women. They make us feel alive. They expand our imagination of femininity. They satiate a hunger for role fluidity that subverts rigid notions of gender. They are figures of fascination and awe to women, fascination and fear to some men. So let's take a little bit of time to look at 6 women who get my attention as fierce and alluring. Contemporary popular culture offers us an array of fierce young women with impressive kinds of power that are essential to the narrative drive of the stories. The central conflict hinges on their effectiveness, which includes skill, focus, and perseverance used on behalf of a well-articulated set of values. Entire books have been written about each one, so it is impossible to do full justice to the characters this morning. The range of specific skills each fierce young woman exercises is quite broad, already demonstrating a variegated idea of power. I will first look at one extreme end of the spectrum, Elizabeth Salander from the Millennium Trilogy. Next, I will examine the heroes from 2 dystopian trilogies, Hunger Games and Divergent. Then I will discuss the second wave of fierce women from 3 films, Daenerys Targaryen, the Mother of Dragons, in the HBO miniseries Game of Thrones, the 2017 summer blockbuster Wonder Woman, and Wakanda's female honor guard, the Dora Milaje, from 2018's Black Panther. So let's start with Lisbeth. The Millennium Trilogy, Swedish mainstream novels and films, are better known by the description of the lead character, Lisbeth Salander, the girl with the dragon tattoo. She's a marvelous creation, as unnerving as she is alluring. The popularity of the novels have been attributed largely to readers' fascination with her. And that fascination includes the important fact that Larson endows his female lead with qualities that might have passed unnoticed if she were male. As one critic states, a brilliant, monosyllabic, arrogant male computer hacker with little emotional expression who has a plan to put old guard authority figures in their place is a familiar stereotype in fiction. But a female? No, that draws attention. So Lisbeth illuminates the fallacies involved in rigid gender roles, confronting us with this question: why are we so interested in limiting our range of behavior? Lisbeth defies a conventional gender role in many ways, most notably by possessing a pitiless strategic intellect aided by photographic memory. She is a brilliant self-taught computer hacker, a respected member of an international elite group of hackers who know her by the pseudonym Wasp. This skill gives Lisbeth a predatory edge. She nonchalantly hacks the computers of many people, including allies, yet targets her predation against men who hate women, the original Swedish title of the first novel. When pressed, Lisbeth is also a physical threat despite her diminutive size, in part because she coldly assesses this potential weakness in herself and does something about it. Lisbeth becomes a skilled martial artist. As several characters in the story learn, it is best not to disturb, provoke, or annoy her. Katniss Everdeen. The fierce young woman at the heart of the Hunger Games grows up in a bleak dystopian world that reflects the actual fears of political, economic, and environmental collapse among young people today. One critic ominously described the Hunger Games as the novel of their generation, because it depicts adolescents rigorously trained by adults for desperate but meaningless life or death competitions. The Divergent trilogy, the other trilogy that also features a dystopian world, is equally dark and equally empty, not because children are forced to fight to the death for the amusement of the glittering inhabitants of a capital, but because the population is segregated into strictly defined factions, none of which offers a whole life, only partial existence. Katniss, the protagonist of the Hunger Games, is allowed what we so seldom see in books or movies: the freedom to be a person first and anything else, which may include her gender, second. She's portrayed as a natural predator, agile, strong, and highly skilled with the bow and arrow, for the purpose of survival, not sport. She hunts every day in order to feed her starving family. So her pack is clearly her family, her friends, and the wider community of District 12, all the world she knows as the trilogy begins. The wealth of the capital, however, is a grotesque contrast to the widespread squalor of her home district, which is the area that she first glimpses when she participates in the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games trilogy holds up a mirror to the growing economic divide in contemporary America. The character of Tris Pryor from the Divergent trilogy has a journey from self-sacrifice and social modesty, once unambiguously prescribed for women, toward the adept, aggressive, confident stance of a warrior. She's born into abnegation, the faction devoted to service, but shocks her family by choosing Dauntless, the faction that prizes physical strength, courage, and audacity to the point of recklessness. For Tris, awakening to her own daring is awakening to her essential self. It also connects her more fully to her mother, who was born into Dauntless, and, as Tris discovered, is a capable warrior in her own right. The trilogy dramatizes the development of her courage, stamina, and toughness, which is portrayed as both a mental and a physical feat. To conclude, who and what each woman loves is deeply interfused. It's the foundation for their identity, gives them an opportunity to develop and exercise their powers, and actively shapes their sphere of influence. They are not domesticated. So to move on, I want to mention and show just a couple of the second wave of fierce young women. Imperator Furiosa from Mad Max Fury Road, and Rey from the Star Wars, the final Star Wars trilogy. Nicole Sperling, who writes for Entertainment Weekly, says, Rey's femininity isn't a weakness and it isn't a strength. In fact, it isn't a thing at all. Not only is this remarkable for a female movie character, it's revolutionary. Both Imperator Furiosa and Rey are battle-hardened veterans, which is an important aspect of their character. In other words, aspects of their character are drawn forth by their context. The stakes in these dystopian stories are high, and the characters' physical and mental capacities are absolutely necessary to survival. What is very significant, though, about both of these films is that they are sequels to male-centered origin stories. Star Wars in 1977 centered on Luke Skywalker, and Mad Max in 1979 centered on Max Rokitansky. 4 decades after these original films were produced, audiences were asked to identify with a strong, often silent, often solitary, focused, and determined woman who seeks to protect others, not to be protected. Within the stories, the fact that they are female is never questioned. It is simply accepted. as though the culture has already moved well beyond coercing women into traditional gender roles. A few final images for us before I reach my conclusion. The fierce women from HBO's series Game of Thrones. The closest thing Game of Thrones had to a protagonist, Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons. Wonder Woman from the 2017 film, which is both about time and timing. A.O. Scott, the New York Times film critic, says, Diana Prince wants to function freely in the world, to help out when needed and to be respected for her abilities. No wonder she encounters so much resistance. The important point about Wonder Woman as the film, however, is that it depicts not just a single Wonder Woman, Diana Prince. It depicts an entire family, a tribe of Wonder Women, all of them beautiful, elegant, and formidable. Moving on to the last film that I want to talk about, the film that should have won the 2018 Oscar for Best Picture. This is from, of course, Black Panther. This is a picture of the Dora Milaje, the Wakandan female martial corps. The film was memorable because of its fierce women, in particular the Dora Milaje. They were supremely talented, that is very scary, female honor guard whose loyalty to the throne was matched only by their skill in defending it. The Dora Milaje are led by General Okoye, played by Danai Gurira. She is just one of a small group of remarkable women who are fully realized film characters. They are beautiful and strong, sexy and smart, deeply loyal, and nobody's pawn. Like Diana Prince from Wonder Woman, they have clearly defined values and will die for them. Jamie Broadnax, who is a self-described Black female comic book geek, says Black Panther takes that supernatural, extraordinary stuff of modern myth and gives it to a bunch of characters who aren't white men and include Black women. This film bolsters our confidence and gives us the courage to believe in how we see ourselves. I'm going to stop the PowerPoint and conclude. The fierce young women I've discussed today are characterized by great vitality, passion, and role fluidity that often challenges congealed ideas about traditional femininity. In struggling to find what they belong to, they carry stories and dreams and words and songs and signs and symbols for millions of people around the world, young and old, male and female. Such stories sharpen our sight so that we can pick out and pick up the path. They reassure the fierce young women alive and well in all of us that the path has not run out, but still leads us deeper and more deeply still into our own knowing. I hope more women, more people move deeply into their own stories so that they can develop and use their powers on behalf of what they love. To support them, we must think what it means to be fierce and question the ways we have circumscribed a woman's natural martial qualities. Perhaps martial qualities for the majority of women in the world went underground for a time. The history of female activism assures us that they have never disappeared. To be martial, fierce, aggressive, assertive, spirited, action-oriented, vital, and driven is to be human. Martial qualities help us name, confront, and dissolve meta-narratives of oppression. Today, archetypal Mars expresses itself in where we organize, when we march, what we say, and how we vote. We need our martial qualities if we want to live our values in troubled, risky times and create a more just world. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise. Thank you very much. You're on mute, Jessica.
Oh, Dr. Nelson, we have a few minutes now to take some questions from the Q&A box. So if anyone has questions for Dr. Nelson, feel free to type it at the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So our first question, she was saying that the webinar has really been resonating with her, and she agrees that she has felt like a threat as a strong woman and has dealt with toxic masculinity. So she wants to know, how can she learn more about herself so she can stand with other women and change toxicity coming from her own subconscious?
That's such a fine question. Oh, great question. I think one of the first things that I always do with this kind of a question is I invite you to really think about your own assumptions about power, personal power, as well as power out in the world. And follow Hillman's lead and think of different kinds of power. So one of the things that you might do is, if you will, write a biography, write an autobiography of yourself that explores when and how you have used various kinds of power in your life. And think as broadly as possible. So for example, we can think of physical power. Some people are blessed with robust health, for instance. So you may have the athletic ability or the great vitality. That is a form of power. Another form of power that seems to maybe be more characteristic of older women, a little less characteristic of younger women, although it varies, is persistence. I think of so many older women who demonstrate patience and persistence as kinds of powers. So one thing to do is to do this autobiography of yourself. What kinds of power do you have? Another is to gather with a small group of women and ask, sort of discuss this. What kinds of powers do you have? The other thing to do is to name where you confront systemic misogyny, where you confront toxic masculinity, and how can you stand up for that, stand up against that, I should say. So the other thing that I want to say about power is that, a lot of times people think that if I don't have a very large circle of influence, if I don't have 3 million Twitter followers, then, I don't have any power. That is not true. Your circle of influence might be much smaller than say, a best-selling author or a celebrity, but you have power, the power of influence within your local tribe. So never doubt that, the extent of your influence, even in your small ecosystem in which you live and work and play. That's a start.
Thank you. Let's take our next question. Somebody wants to know about the contrast between these modern examples and examples from the women's liberation movement in the 1960s.
Second wave feminism, yes. We've now had, I guess we're counting like 4 waves of feminism. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about the new feminism, that is the feminism of the 21st century, which it responds to some of the criticisms of the feminism of the 1960s, which tended to be colorblind and also class blind. In other words, some of the second wave feminists made the assumption that their experience as white women, for instance, could be easily ported to Black women or Native women or Asian American women, and that class didn't really matter. And one of the things that we know about feminism is that there are feminisms. There are many, many kinds of feminism. And there are, when we talk about these meta-narratives, We want to bring in the idea of what's called intersectionality, which is that systemic misogyny can intersect with systemic racism, so that a Black woman actually might be facing multiple forms of oppression. Even more if she is in a lower economic class and just has trouble making ends meet. So there would be an economic oppression. So these various forms of oppression link together and overlap and reinforce one another. In terms of fiction, if we look at the fiction from well, we don't see the fiction in the 60s or the 70s changing too much. If we start looking at the fiction even in the 1980s, we will begin to see sort of the precursor to some of the fictional females that I've mentioned that start getting our attention in 2005. But the key difference, the wholesale transformation in the fairy tale that John Powers identified, that NPR commentator, is that the stories are built around a woman. It's not built around a man with female sidekicks. I hope that partially answers the question. These are all great questions. I could say more about any one of them.
For our next question, can you share some of the courses that you have taught at Pacifica? And they also want to know a little bit more. I know you teach in the integrative therapy and healing practices program, so they want to know a little bit about some of the featured courses.
Sure, absolutely. Well, my expertise at Pacifica is in research. So I'm in charge of the research curriculum for the depth therapy program, and I've helped design research curriculum for three other programs. So what that means is things like foundations of research, scholarly writing, qualitative research, mixed methods research, dissertation development. So that whole range of research-oriented courses is something that has become a bit of an area of expertise. I think it probably grows out of my my many years of experience as a professional writer and editor. I really love teaching research because I help I catch the excitement of my students when they first connect to a dissertation topic, and then just watch them grow into their research expertise, and become scholars, which is just such a wonderful thing to see. Other courses that I teach at Pacifica, I've taught courses in Dream. I am still currently teaching courses in technology, and I teach that across 2 different programs. And what I mean by technology is, for instance, in the somatics program, I teach a course that's entitled Psyche, Soma, Cyborg. And I look at the way in which mobile digital technology in particular has transformed all of us in the first world with access to such technology into kind of a part machine, part human hybrid. So it's a very interesting course on technology and the soul. I've taught a few others. Oh, archetypal psychology, I teach that as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, that is the last question that we have time for. Thank you for your questions. So now we're going to transition to the next part of the day. Starting at 11:30, we will begin the program breakout sessions. So if you go to the landing page, you can click to join the webinar for the program session of your choice. You may need to wait a minute or two to join the meeting as we open them up. So if they don't open up in the first couple of minutes, please be patient. Thank you so much again, Dr. Nelson, for your presentation and for joining, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
Can I say just one more thing to our group?
Of
if
course.
anybody have a chance to answer somebody's question because we ran out of time, feel free to email me with your question at Pacifica. My email is just enelson, ENELSON @pacifica.edu. I'm happy to talk with you.
Thank you.